Up, coming up. The internet's fast, but not always instant. Oh, and helps if I don't push the wrong buttons. There we go. All right. So the YouTube feed is working. And let me get back to my primary screen. There we go. You know what? That can be a little bigger. Yeah, that'll work. Have to compromise with how much text we can get on the screen with how big we need to make it. And unfortunately, although Safari does a lot of things great, I don't like their text scaling very well. Trying to do it natively, not so handy. Trying to do it with the general zoom, well, as you can see, it leaves a large menu at the top. But I think we'll be able to handle that small inconvenience in exchange for all of the wonderful things that we can do together by sharing the resource. All right, we have made it past our 12:01 mark, our traditional start. So let's go ahead and get down to work. We are in Parashat Shemini. We're going to begin with chapter 11, right up at verse number 1. And we are going to look at one of the most famous sections of Jewish life that a lot of people don't give enough attention to. Now, when I say don't give enough attention to, I mean that very specifically. We're going to be talking about kashrut. Now, everybody knows about kashrut. Not everybody knows everything about it, but everyone knows that kashrut exists. If I were to ask you name a kosher animal, I'm sure you could pick out cow. If I were to say name a non-kosher animal, I'm sure you could pick out pig. However, why? Now, very importantly, we've talked in previous classes, which are scattered around my YouTube archives, about why kashrut at all, and why specific animals were or were not kosher. But there is an underlying mitzvah that many of us don't pay much attention to. We live in a blessed age when it comes to kashrut in many ways, because we live at a time when kashrut, well, most of the decisions are taken out of our hands. We are not slaughtering our own animals. We are not wandering through the wilderness encountering new beasts. We are, by and large, buying our meat prepared, already butchered, even salted and washed, ready to go from the supermarket. And as such, we're missing out on the ability to engage in one of the primary mitzvot that comes with kashrut, which is being able to identify what is kosher and what is not kosher based upon the signs of the animal. That this is not something that was meant to be purely absorbed by the marketing department of the kosher butchers, but this was something that was supposed to be handled by the individual and that each of us should be familiar with. So we're going to go through chapter 11 here, just the first 20 verses or so, and we're going to look at the signs of kashrut, and then we're going to delve a little more deeply using primarily the words of Rambam from his Mishnah Torah to see that there are more nuances here than we might have suspected, which along the way will not only teach us how to identify what's kosher and not kosher, but may also illuminate a few more insights as well. Chapter 11, verse 1. Adonai spoke to Moshe and Aharon, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, these are the living creatures that you may eat, from all the domestic animals that are upon the earth." All right, so let me just clarify a couple of things here. We have the phrase living creature, and then we have the phrase domestic animal, and that is representing two different words in the Hebrew. Chaya is the word for a living creature, coming from the same root as the word chaim, which means life, and as such, Fox's translation as living creature is a pretty good capture of that original Hebrew. And then behema is being used here to refer to the subclass of creatures that are domesticated animals. And we're going to see that there is a difference between how we treat a kosher wild animal and a kosher domestic animal, but more on that later. As a little side note, if you see the word behema, you may recognize the root of the English word behemoth, which comes from this same source as meaning a huge beast. Verse 3. anyone having a hoof cleaving, a cleft in its hooves, bringing up the cud among the animals, that one you may eat. Potts tries to capture the Hebrew, but it's a little bit awkward compared to the usual formulation we hear in English, which is a cloven hoof and chews its cud. Those are the two signs for what counts as a kosher animal. And a reminder that the classic cloven hoof model is that of a cow or a goat, which has the toe, the nail at the bottom of an animal broken into two pieces that are completely separated. Unlike, for example, a horse, which has a unified toe nail all the way around as a curve. Chewing the cud is referring probably, and this is something we're going to talk about near the end, to the bringing up of the cud of the and the ruminant type animals that will chew vegetation. It will then go through a multi-chambered stomach process, and as part of that process, some of it will be regurgitated into the mouth to be chewed upon further by the ruminant animal in order to break it down to its next level so that more nutrients can be taken out of it. It takes a lot of effort to get nutrition from plants. And as such, the animals that do the most of that, these herbivores, have a special system for making that work. That is called chewing the cud, although we're going to see that this ma'alat gera, the Hebrew word, may refer to a larger category of mastication, of chewing, than the technical definition of chewing the cud. But more on that when we get to the exceptions. However, these you are not to eat from those bringing up the cud or those having a hoof, meaning there are some animals that do chew their cud. There are some animals that do chew their cud, and there are some animals that do have a cloven hoof, but they lack the opposite, the additional sign. So some animals will chew their cud, but don't have a cloven hoof. And an example of that would be the camel, right? The camel, for it brings up the cud, but a hoof it does not have. It is tameh for you. So as you are probably familiar with, because it is the standard cartoon and movie depiction of a camel, camels are often shown chewing and spitting. And that is because the camel, although it has a three-chambered stomach, has the behavior, I guess is the right word, of chewing the cud, as exemplified by its chewing motion and spitting. So camels do chew their cud. They do match the definition of the bringing up of the cud, but they do not qualify as having a cloven hoof, and therefore they are not kosher. They have one sign, but not both, and both are required for an animal to be kosher. And then verse 5, the hyrax, shafan in the Hebrew, for it brings up the cud, but a hoof it does not have. It is tameh for you. You're probably not familiar with the word hyrax, and I don't blame you. This is a fairly uncommon animal that lives in the Near East. It is often called the rock badger, and if you've ever visited En Gedi or one of the other areas in that the Jordan Valley, you may have seen them in some of the nature reserves. They are very cute. They look like a rodent. They are not a rodent. And importantly for our conversation, they actually do not bring up a cud in the classic definition of that word in English. This ma'ale gera that's being used here with the hyrax means that we cannot be talking only about the behavior of ruminants, that there are other animals that do this action that are not in the modern taxonomy labeled alongside of things like cows and camels, cows and camels and sheep and other things that ruminate. So that means this ma'ale gera has to have a broader definition. The hyrax does have a chewing behavior that looks like it is chewing the cud. That is to say, it is a very similar activity to the behavior of a cow or a goat, but its anatomy is such that it is not actually chewing a cud in the biological sense. As such, many commentators have argued that when we say ma'ale gera, we don't mean just an animal that chews its cud according to modern biology, but we mean an animal that ancient people might have thought was chewing the cud, given that they didn't have access to modern dissection techniques and animal analysis. They might have thought that this was resembling that. Now, why would it be important that that would be the case? That it would be according to the behavior of the animal as visible to people in the ancient world rather than modern scientific investigation? Well, as you can see, the hyrax here does have a cloven hoof. Now, if I was trying to identify if an animal was kosher and I saw that it had cloven hooves and I saw that it looked like it was chewing its cud and I was hungry, then my next step would probably be to eat it because it is exhibiting both signs. You'll note that, and we'll talk about this in more detail in our extensive commentaries, that we are not required to undergo a 5-year biological investigation into the behavior and anatomy of an animal. We are looking for 2 very outward signs. As such, the Torah is most likely trying to inform us that although the hyrax looks like it is chewing the cud, it doesn't have a cloven hoof, and that means it's definitely not in the running. So no matter how similar it seems, it isn't actually chewing the cud. Sorry, it doesn't actually have the hoof, so that's okay. And you don't have to do any further investigation to prove its non-kosherness on the cud variety. So it is probably using, as we often say, the language of humanity, the language of people, meaning that the Torah is using the idiomatic expression here of ma'ale gera, of chewing the cud. It is not using the scientific or taxonomic definition. It's not using biology. Likewise, for number 6, the hair, for it brings up the cud, but a hoof it does not have, it is tameh for you. Likewise, the hair, anyone who's ever been around rabbits and hares will know, they look like they are also chewing their cud. They're always making that little motion with their face, very cute, adorable. I had a rabbit when I was young, but they are not technically chewing their cud, but that motion would certainly convince or at least confuse an ancient person. And as such, it is pointed out that despite that sign, which you might interpret as being ma'ale gera, nonetheless, because it doesn't have a cloven hoof, it is not a kosher animal. And then finally, the most famous counterexample, the pig. For it has a hoof and cleaves a cleft in the hoof, but as for it, the cud, it does not chew up. So it is tameh for you. So pigs very famously do have a cloven hoof. Their trotter is broken into 2 different pieces. However, they do not chew the cud, nor do they make an action that appears to be chewing the cud. As such, pigs are not kosher. Now, we've had conversations before, so I'm not going to repeat it, about how it was the pig became the most common animal associated with non-kosher. After all, as you can tell by this, mammals of all types are not kosher except for a very narrow range. Maybe cows and sheep and goats, but pigs are not kosher, but neither are dogs or cats, neither are squirrels or rabbits, as we just saw, nor are things like wolves or other wild beasts that someone might have come across. So why is it that the pig became most synonymous with not kosher? Well, because it became the most common differentiator between Jewish and non-Jewish eating. That is to say, while it is true that things like squirrels, or maybe even dogs and cats, and in some cases horses, might have been eaten in some communities, pigs were a major staple in most communities around the world that had access to them as domesticated animals. Pigs are an incredibly useful animal for a small family farm sort of setting. It doesn't require as much grazing ground as a goat or a sheep, and they can produce meat very, very quickly. in a way that's really, really handy, excuse me, if you are, well, looking for meat without having to go hunting. So when Jews didn't eat pork, it really stood out. The fact that we passed up what might have been the occasional squirrel in someone else's diet was not so surprising, but the fact that we passed up on pork really did stick out as a very surprising behavior when we were amongst other nations. Moving on, just so that we can cover a few more signs of a few more animals. From their flesh you are not to eat, their carcasses you are not to touch, they are tameh for you. These you may eat from all that are in the water. Moving on from the land animals. Anyone that has fins and scales in the water, whether in the seas or in the streams, them you may eat. Freshwater, saltwater, it has to have fins, it has to have scales. If it doesn't have those two features, then it is not a kosher animal from the water. As it says in verse 10, but anyone that does not have fins and scales, whether in the seas or in the streams, from all swarming things in the water, from all living beings that are in the water, they are detestable things for you. Pointing out, even among the things in the water that don't have either of those, such things as, for example, a whale or a dolphin, they are also not kosher. If it's in the water, whether it is shrimp or a whale, whether it is an eel or whether it is a turtle, it's got to have fins and scales, and all the ones I just mentioned do not meet that qualification, which is why they're not kosher. But things like your classic trout or salmon or bass, those are all perfectly fine. Or, of course, the classic gefilte fish, which can be found in many waters. That's a joke. Gefilte fish is a way of preparing the fish. It's not an actual fish. Classically, it was made with carp. Verse 11, and they shall remain detestable things for you. From their flesh you are not to eat, their carcasses you are to detest. Anyone that does not have fins and scale in the water, it is a detestable thing for you. Okay, hopefully that is nice and clear, and will limit your menu options considerably. Verse 13. Now, these you are to hold detestable from birds. They are not to be eaten, they are detestable things. You will immediately note that birds are not given a sign, birds are given a list of prohibited birds, which means that the majority of bird species are kosher. However, as you'll see from the list, although Fox does a great job of translating all of these, many of these translations are contested, that there is arguments over exactly which type of bird these are. As such, it is more classically found that although the Talmud deduces the signs, which can be found in my Mishnah class on Chulin, that nonetheless, we generally avoid birds that we're not familiar with or have consulted with an expert on before we eat them. So what are the ones as listed in Fox's translation, which, like I say, is a hotly debated topic? The eagle, the bearded vulture, the black vulture, the kite and the falcon after its kind, meaning all varieties, every sort of raven after its kind, the desert owl, the screech owl, the seagull, the falcon after its kind, the little owl, the cormorant, the great owl, the barn owl, the pelican, the Egyptian vulture, the stork, the heron after its kind, the hopi, and the bat. All of those are not kosher. You'll notice, of course, that the bat is not a technical bird, but it is a flying creature, and as such, it is enumerated as not acceptable. Verse 20, let's just round this off with the final species category. Any flying, swarming creature that goes about on all fours, it is a detestable thing for you. We are talking here about bugs. So bugs as a category are not kosher. However, these you may eat from any flying, swarming creature that goes about on all fours. Those that have joint legs above their feet with which to leap on the earth. And handily, we do have an example of that. As for these, from them you may eat the locust after its kind, the bald locust after its kind, the cricket after its kind, and the grasshopper after its kind. So all of those are kosher varieties of insect. And indeed, there are some Jews who do continue to eat them, although I will point out they're not a staple in anybody's diet. But every other flying, swarming creature, that has 4 legs, it is a detestable thing for you. Now, from these, you can become Tamei. Whoever touches their carcass shall be Tamei until sunset. Actually, you know what? Let's leave it off here. I want to make sure we have time for Rambam's analysis of all of this. All right, so we've got all of our categories. If it is a land mammal, then it has to have cloven hooves, and it has to have the propensity to do something that looks like chewing its cud. We're going to come back to that, like I said, in a few more times. Then, if it is a fish, it has to have fins and scales. And if it is a bird, it has to be not from the list of prohibited birds. And if it is a bug, it has to come from the list of permitted bugs, which are types of locust, cricket, and grasshopper. Okay, so I know that everybody is probably a little surprised. I always get extra hands whenever we talk about kosher bugs. But yes, indeed, there are such things as kosher bugs. They're just not commonly on the menu at most Jewish delis. Okay, so let's go ahead then and dive into our discussion from Rambam about these signs. This is taken from the Mishnah Torah, the section regarding forbidden foods, and right at the beginning of chapter 1. It is a positive commandment to know the signs that distinguish between domesticated animals, beasts, fowl, fish, and locusts that are permitted to be eaten, and those which are not permitted. As it says in Leviticus 20, and you shall distinguish between a kosher animal and a non-kosher one, between a non-kosher fowl and a kosher one, and in our chapter here in verse 11, to distinguish between the kosher and the non-kosher, between a beast which may be eaten and one which may not be eaten. So what Rambam is trying to highlight for us, which I mentioned at the beginning, is that it is actually a commandment to know these signs. It is, yes, also a commandment to not eat something that isn't kosher, but while that is simply fulfilled by making sure whatever you're eating has a hechsher on it, for example, thus having been approved by a kosher agency, it does not fulfill this commandment. This commandment tells us that we need to actually know those signs, that while we may be relying upon other agencies to do the inspection of the meat production, for example, that does not mean that we are off the hook for knowing those signs. We still need to know them. As such, we went through our general description in the book here of Leviticus, and we're going to view Rambam's introduction to those signs as well. Obviously, there's a lot more than just 9 paragraphs in Rambam's section on forbidden food. So, the signs of a kosher domesticated animal and beast. Remember, as I mentioned, domesticated and wild can both have kosher varieties, and both will have the same sign, but we do still need to know whether it's domesticated or wild. They are explicitly mentioned in the Torah, like we read. There are 2 signs, a split hoof and chewing the cud. Both are necessary. Any domesticated animal and beast, meaning wild animal, that chews the cud does not have teeth on its upper jawbone. Lo and behold, the rabbis went and did empirical observation to try and double check to see whether or not there were other indicators of whether an animal chewed its cud or not. And what did they find? They found that by and large, the animals that are cud chewing do not have incisors. They may still have molars at the back, but they do not usually have an upper set of incisors for their biological needs. So that then becomes a additional indicator of a cud chewing animal, that lack of incisors. So therefore, every animal that chews the cud has split hooves except a camel. And every animal that has split hooves chews the cud except a pig. So they were able to then, using that anatomy, make a more general statement that if an animal chews the cud, then it will have split hooves, except for a camel. And vice versa. Every animal that has split hooves chews the cud except a pig. What they are setting out here, what Rambam is setting out based upon the arguments in the Talmud, is that these are the 2 exceptions, that by and large, you will find the split hoof and the chewing of the cud as a pair. And the only time you will see them not as a pair are for the camel and the pig. Now, the clever among you are probably wondering, but wait, Rabbi Neely, didn't we also say that the hare and the hyrax were exceptions, that they also chewed the cud, but didn't have split hooves? So wouldn't that mean they should be listed in that same sentence as the camel? Absolutely correct. I'm very proud of you for remembering that. We will come back to that later on. But yes, that's very good that you thought of that. Keep that in mind. Therefore, if a person finds an animal whose hooves are cut off in the desert and he cannot not identify its species, he should check its mouth. All right, let's make sure we got the situation here because we're going to do it twice. You are wandering in a place where there's no one else around, meaning no one else to check with, and you come across an animal and the feet are removed. So all you've got is the upper part of the animal and no feet. Well, how do you know whether it's a kosher animal or not? Because you can't check its hooves. Never mind, you can check its mouth. If it does not have teeth on its upper jaw, it can be identified as kosher, provided one can recognize a camel. So if the camel is the only exception, then as long as you know what a camel looks like, minus the feet, then you should be able to just check the mouth of any animal you come across. And as long as it doesn't have those upper incisors, you can deduce that it must be kosher. Because the camel is the one exception, therefore all other animals that don't have the incisors up there must be chewing the cud and would have cloven hooves because that is the pattern. And thus it would be considered a kosher animal. Now, very important, this animal would almost certainly be dead or at the very least dying, which means you're still not allowed to eat it. Something that is dying from another cause, meaning treifa, or something that is already dead, like roadkill, which is nevela, those are not kosher for consumption. But our handling and use of the body is very different between a kosher and non-kosher in some places, in some circumstances. So we do still need to know whether it's a kosher animal, even if we're not going to be eating it. Now, what is the opposite? If a person finds an animal whose mouth is cut off, meaning the front of its face is mutilated, he should check its hooves. If they are split, it is kosher, provided he can recognize a pig. Since the pig is the only cloven hoofed animal that doesn't chew its cud, well, as long as you can check those feet, then you'll know that it must chew its cud if it has cloven hooves, because that is what the logic says, as the pig being the only exception to that rule. Now, when both its mouth and its hooves are cut off, this poor animal has gone through some real trouble, he should inspect the end of its tail after he slaughters it. If he discovers that the strings of its meat extend both lengthwise and widthwise, it is kosher, provided he can recognize a wild donkey. For the strings of its meat also extend both lengthwise and widthwise. Okay, so if you are a fine connoisseur of meat, you will know that meat has a grain. It is not just a blob, it's not tofu. Meat instead has strands because it is the muscles of the animal. And apparently, not something I've actually checked firsthand, because I've never been around that part of a sheep or similar kosher animals. But apparently, when you are removing the meat around the tail, the meat that is around the tail for a kosher animal will have both vertical and horizontal strands of muscle that are, well, holding the tail together. And apparently the only other animal that does that isn't kosher is a wild donkey. So if you can tell what a wild donkey looks like, then you are going to be okay identifying the kashrut of an animal just by the type of meat fibers that go around the tail. All right. Now, you are probably wondering, Rabbi Neely, why do I need to know this? I am, just going to buy my kosher meat from the local kosher supermarket or section of the kosher section of a supermarket. I don't see the point of understanding that I can check the hooves if I don't see the mouth. I can check the mouth if I don't see the hooves. Why? Well, that's what Rambam said at the beginning. You shall distinguish. You should be able to identify this. Being able to identify the animals that are kosher and not kosher is a commandment. It may not be one that we feel is as relevant as love your neighbor as yourself, or be honest in your business dealings, or returning lost property, or don't murder, but it is still one of the 613 commandments. And as such, we need to have at least a basic familiarity with the different things that are kosher, even in cases, including up to cases where it might be hard to identify. Yes, nowadays there is a very common predilection to always err on the side of just it's not kosher. It's not kosher. Just prohibit it. It's no, reject it. I don't have everything in order. The paperwork's not complete, so to speak. It's not kosher. What Rambam is showing us from 1,000 years ago, and based upon the Talmud, which was earlier even than that, is that it's not enough to just say, if I'm not sure, I won't try to identify whether it's kosher or not. We are commanded to actually do our best to differentiate between what is kosher and what is not kosher. And that means even in a case where the corpse of the animal has been mutilated, we are still required to try and figure it out using the best information that we have from the body and the best information we have from halakha to determine whether it is kosher or not. Doesn't mean we have to do anything more than that, but we are asked to be able to tell the difference. And this, I can tell you, is a very fun way to spend the day at the zoo, to go ahead and try and identify every animal that you see as whether it is kosher or not. It gives you a different appreciation for walking through the supermarket of different creatures and trying to figure out which ones would or would not be kosher. You may have to double check the cud chewing, however, because most online, because most zoos do not allow you to examine the mouths of the animals up close. Although, if you are lucky and go to a petting zoo, you may be able to get a glimpse of some of them and check it, from the horse's mouth, as they say. All right. Now, we do have some other unusual cases, which you may be scratching your head about, but are nonetheless part of the mitzvah of identifying kosher or not kosher, and hopefully will also give us some interesting tidbits to go with it. When a kosher animal gives birth to an offspring resembling a non-kosher animal, it is permitted to be eaten, even though it does not have split hooves or chew the cud, but instead resembles a horse and donkey in all matters. All right, let's make sure we got this sentence down because it sounds pretty radical, and it is, at least to the modern ears that have been overfilled with cries of prohibition when it comes to food. So you have your cow, and your cow gives birth, and out of the back of your cow comes something that doesn't have cloven hooves and it doesn't chew its cud. It looks like a horse, for crying out loud. But it came from a kosher animal. Well, what is its status? Its status is kosher. That if it is from a kosher animal, then it is a kosher offspring of that animal, even if that individual representative lacks those signs. Now, why would that be important? Well, that would be important because, as anybody who's ever worked on a large farm will know, animals don't always come out looking like their baby book versions. They're not always perfectly formed. There are deformities and imperfections in animals all the time, just as there are huge varieties in how humans are born. And just as we would not call somebody not human because they had a misshapen hand, for example, we would not call an animal no longer part of its species just because it has a misshapen hoof. As such, the halakha is reminding us that the individual characteristics of an animal are not the determinant. It is the species of the animal that is the determinant. And so this animal born from the mother is one that we will accept. Now, why are we then saying that it has to be born from the mother if the species is what's the determinant? Well, in the ancient world, we didn't really have an easy way to determine species other than by checking the immediate family tree. That means that if the animal wandered in off the street, we would not give it the same credibility, as Rambam explains. When does the above apply, that we go ahead and quite literally grandfather the animal in as kosher? when we see it give birth. If, however, he left a pregnant cow in his herd and found an animal resembling a pig dependent on it, meaning suckling from the cow, the matter is doubtful, and the young animal is forbidden to be eaten. This applies even if it nurses from the cow, for perhaps it was born from a non-kosher species, but became dependent on the kosher animal. So if there is a chance that a non-kosher animal has somehow gotten in mixed among your animals, then we cannot rely on it unless we actually saw it give birth. If it gave birth and it's still identical to a pig, if we saw it come out and we're there for that magic moment, then the animal is kosher. But if we did not see it give birth and there is some doubt that it might have come from outside the flock, herd, then we are not allowed to rely on that. So if someone walks up to you with a pig on the street and says, "Hey, buddy, want to buy a cow?" And you say, "That's not a cow, it's a pig." And he says, "No, no, no, it was born from a cow." We're allowed to be suspicious of that. But if it's your own, by all means, embrace that lovely little pig cow and eat it as kosher, should that thought occur to you at that time, rather than using it for, I don't know, social media clout. I'm sure there must be YouTube videos out there of interesting animals. I haven't gone looking for them, and I don't think I will. So again, this is an indication that the halakha is going by what we are perceiving and watching. It is not looking for perfect representatives of a species, but it does need to have a tie to that species, as mentioned here by the birth. Okay, if just a second. We got a YouTube question here. Is this... Okay, so the question that we got from YouTube is asking whether this sort of conversation is mostly about just emergency situations, or is it something that should be known even if you're not going to eat the meat anyway? I think I've already answered that, which means that the YouTube is still a little lagging there. And the answer is yes, that it is definitely usable even if we're not planning to eat the meat. However, it is even more important if we are in an emergency situation. So going back to our dead animal in the wilderness hypothetical, if you are in the middle of the wilderness and you are starving, and you come across the body of an animal and you're not sure whether it's kosher or not, certainly if you are starving, you can eat it. However, if you come across the body of two animals and one of them is definitely kosher and one of them is definitely not kosher, then if you can survive on just the animal that is kosher, then it is preferable to eat from it. Even though eating from nevela, an animal that's already dead, a carcass, is a prohibition, it is an additional prohibition to not eating from a non-kosher animal. As such, one would only be superseding one mitzvah in order to stay alive, rather than two mitzvot to stay alive. And even in danger, we do try to minimize the number of mitzvahs that we are breaking. However, like I said, if there is no choice, if it is a case of eat or die, then we eat from any animal, because our primary requirement is to live through the commandments, not to die through their observation. All right, moving on to another alternative problem. When a non-kosher animal gives birth to an offspring resembling a kosher animal, it is forbidden to be eaten. So your horse, probably one of the most common large domesticated animals that a person might have on their farm, it gives birth to an animal, and it looks an awful lot like a goat or a deer, which are both kosher animals. Can I eat it? No, you may not. For the same reason that we can eat from the previous category, we cannot eat from this one, because whatever deformities the animal might have that makes it look kosher, we know that it came from a non-kosher mother, and therefore it is a non-kosher animal. This applies even if it has split hooves and chews its cud and resembles an ox or sheep in all matters. The rationale is that offspring produced by a non-kosher animal are not kosher, and those produced by a kosher animal are kosher. For this reason, A non-kosher fish found in the belly of a kosher fish is forbidden, and a kosher fish found in the belly of a non-kosher fish is permitted, for they do not produce the fish, but instead swallowed it. And just to add a little twist, to show that our ancestors did understand quite a lot of biology, they knew that fish did not grow new fish inside of them, that they do not have live birth in the way that a mammal does. And as such, if you found a fish inside another fish, we don't believe that fish grew there. Instead, we think the first fish swallowed it, which means you find a very big fish, say a shark, and that's not kosher. But you cut the shark open, and inside you find a lovely kosher-looking fish. We don't worry that it's a baby shark, because that's not how sharks do it. Instead, we believe that the shark swallowed that fish, and that means that fish is a kosher fish, and you are permitted to eat it. And the opposite, if you happen to find a non-kosher fish inside of a kosher fish, salmon ate something, the tuna ate something, that doesn't make a difference. It's still not kosher because it's definitely not the tuna's babies inside of it. Okay, hopefully that speaks for itself. And let's go ahead then and take a look at the next section. You'll notice that I did have to skip a few paragraphs here. As always, please go back to Safaria and take a look. But we are moving ourselves into that domesticated and wild description and which ones really we can rely on. So here goes Rambam. There are no other domesticated animals or wild beasts in the world that are permitted to be eaten except the 10 species mentioned in the Torah. They are 3 types of domesticated animals, an ox, a sheep, and a goat, and 7 types of wild beasts, a gazelle, a deer, an antelope, an ibex, a chamois, a bison, and a giraffe. This includes the species itself and its subspecies. For example, the wild ox and buffalo are subspecies of the ox. All of these 10 species and their subspecies chew the cud and have split hooves. Therefore, a person who recognizes these species need not check either their mouths nor their feet. All right, so those are our standard kosher animals. These are the ones that we can rely on. They are all mentioned in the Torah, probably. Giraffe and bison, there's some debate of exactly on that. But certainly they match the criteria. And yes, giraffe is kosher, as is bison and buffalo. Those are perfectly fine kosher animals, just very hard to find somebody that will slaughter them, although there are some kosher buffalo slaughterers in the US. Now, that being said, we're going to have to come back to the question of whether these truly are the only animals that are actually kosher. That is a question that we'll have to scratch our head. After all, Rambam was writing 1,000 years ago, and he had limited access to information about species in the New World, as well as many other parts of Asia and Africa, and of course, even Europe at the time was not fully mapped in all of its animal diversity. So let's get back to that question about the difference between the wild and the domesticated. Although all these species are permitted to be eaten, we must make a distinction between a kosher domesticated animal and a kosher wild beast. So you see a deer and you go, aha, a deer is kosher, great. And you see a sheep and you go, aha, a sheep is kosher, great. That's only step 1. You do also have to remember the deer is considered a wild kosher animal and the sheep is considered a domestic kosher animal. Why is that important? For the fat of a wild beast is permitted to be eaten, and its blood must be covered, meaning when the blood is being drained out of a wild animal, we push dirt over the top of the blood that has spilt on the ground. And the special fat that is on the organs of a wild animal can be eaten or used. However, with regard to a kosher domesticated animal, by contrast, one is liable for karet, for partaking of its fat, and its blood need not be covered. The Torah makes a distinction. that if this is a sheep or goat or cow, for example, then we have to remove that certain parts of the organ fat because those were reserved only for the altar, and we are not allowed to eat or use it. However, the blood that is drained out of the kosher domesticated animals does not need to be covered with dirt after it's been drained. So there is a distinction to be made between both wild and domesticated types of kosher animals. Okay. Now, before we finish up, we're going to actually just look at something I tried to jot down to give us the talking points. There was unfortunately not enough room to go into it in more detail, but there is a question about these animals being truly the only version. I want to look first at the one that is most easily disputed, of whether these are the only animals that have one kosher sign. You may remember we had the list of the camel, the pig, the hare, and the hyrax as being the only animals listed in the Torah as having one kosher sign. Now, for many centuries, it was believed that the Torah's list was not only correct, but exhaustive. That is to say, there have been many people, indeed, even when I was young, that would say that when the Torah lists those four, it wasn't listing four examples of animals that have one kosher sign, but not two. It was listing the only animals that had one kosher sign. And as such, it was representative of the wisdom of God. As I wrote, many outreach programs have tried to use it, that this is an exhaustive list, as a sign of divine authorship, that no other animals have been discovered in 3,000 years that also have one sign. However, this is not correct. So although many people have tried to use this as proof of the divinity of God, it is one of the many incorrect claims that are made by well-meaning groups that rely on faulty science or history. I know that there were many people back in the 1800s that would argue that you could tell the Bible was true because men had fewer ribs than women, because God had taken a rib from man in order to make Eve. No one seemed to ever bother to count the number of ribs that men and women have. It's the same. There is no difference between them. But it was one of those things that was passed along as being true because it was supporting what people wanted it to support. And within Judaism, we have this particular version as well, that there are only these four. Now, as I mentioned earlier, first, in order to understand how this is not true, the definition of chewing the cud in particular has to be recognized as broader than assumed. Neither the hyrax nor the hare chew the cud the way a true ruminant does. So if we are going to say that ma'ale gera is the sign for a kosher animal, and we are going to say that both the hyrax and the hare engage in that, then we have to recognize that this cannot be just chewing the cud in the narrow zoological definition of a true ruminant, because neither the hare nor the hyrax do anything that is like the true chewing the cud. Now, that means that we look at other animals that do have that same type of behavior, which is called mericism, which is the behavior of chewing additionally, but not as an essential element of the digestive process. That is to say, they sometimes chew, but they're not obligated, if you will, by their biology to chew. And things like the capybara, the kangaroo, the llama, and many others make that same action. They make that same additional chew, but they are definitely not a kosher animal. Capybara, just too cute anyway, but they do fit that same pattern that a hare or a hyrax do, which is to say they look like they are engaging in chewing in the cud, but they lack a cloven hoof, and as such, we cannot call them kosher. And as such, it means that the list that's mentioned in the Torah was not intended by the Torah to be considered exhaustive. And this is an important point that I want to just try and step aside and put into your mind to help you with other things that you might come across, which is to say that many well-meaning people or organizations will trot out different proofs of the validity of Torah. And when they do so, they will often be making claims about the Torah that are not made by the Torah. So the Torah itself never said, these are the only 4 animals with only one kosher sign. However, later people did take it as being an exhaustive list, and because of that, they opened themselves up and Judaism up to attack by those who have a broader understanding of the biology of the natural world. Now, that attack is not against Torah, because Torah never made that claim. That attack is against those who have falsely believed that Torah was making that claim. I know that can be a little confusing. We have a tendency to overlap our protection of Torah with our protection of the authorities or self-proclaimed authorities on Torah. But while Torah itself is always true, our interpretation, and even the interpretation of people who have great pedigrees, is not always correct. And when we come to evidence that shows that their interpretation is false, we should not take that as evidence that the Torah is false. It just means that our understanding needs adjustment in order to be a better representation of what the Torah has been trying to tell us for 3,000 years, but we had lacked the information to understand until the modern times. And this is one example. Likewise, we can have other issues with how we define multi-part hooves. That could also expand the list of animals with only one sign, because there are quite a few animals that do have hooves that probably count as cloven, but definitely don't chew their cud. But that would mean that the pig was not the only representative of that category. However, one thing that is quite interesting is that while we have discovered new subspecies of animals with 2 signs, no completely novel kosher animal has been discovered for thousands of years. So yes, we did come across things like the giraffe, and we did come across things like various gazelle and antelope and deer in many far-flung parts of the world, which certainly were not known to the people who lived in ancient Israel. And as I already mentioned, the North American buffalo was definitely not known to the people of ancient Israel, but it does have the kosher criteria. However, all of those are, even according to modern biological taxonomy, found within families that are already represented by the kosher animals mentioned in the Torah and in Halakha. So while we have found many other non-kosher animals that have 1 sign but not 2, we have not found any other totally new kosher species that has both signs of chewing the cud and cloven hoof. So we haven't added to the menu, but we, except for varieties of the same creature, like, every variety of sheep, but we also have, I think we can say that we are fairly certain now that there is no other completely new type of animal out there that is going to clip-clop its way onto the kosher menu. We've pretty much got them all clear, and they are all connected to what we knew 3,000 years ago. They are just new examples of the same broad species. So it is amazing what the Torah knows. It is amazing what we have access to. It is also important to recognize what we don't know, and to recognize where our old beliefs, which were our beliefs and not the Torah's, need updating. That is part of the interplay. And like I said, this is not just a matter of idle curiosity. This is also a matter of fulfilling the mitzvah that we discussed at the beginning, which is to be able to know if an animal is kosher or not. It is not enough as a Jew to simply know, I can trust this hechsher, this mark on my package of meat, and know that the animal is kosher. I do need to, at least to a minimum, engage in enough study to be able to spot whether an animal is kosher or not on my own. As I said, go to the zoo, broaden your horizons, and you'll be surprised at what is and what is not kosher as you walk around the exhibits. With that, we will wrap it up for today. I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their week. And if you're in person, please come by tonight and we can continue our discussions in the Need to Talk